So today we're going to do a follow-up based on questions that you all have had after the release last week. Michael's joining us today. He's going to help fill in some gaps. You'll hear a lot of my voice again today as well. We're going to take some live questions during the call, but we did get some good questions on the sign-up page, so thank you very much. Rather than doing them verbatim, we tried to group them and kind of classify those into more topics so that they can be discussed. But of course, if you did not get your specific question answered, Michael and team can certainly help through tickets, our help desk email, and of course, setting up calls for consultations as well. As we mentioned here for our agenda, Michael, you had mentioned when you were looking at the aggregating these questions here, this was kind of a a general question that came up a lot.
Yeah, it's usually the first question we'll get in a ticket when somebody's ready to dive into the whole one-to-one consent, and they're just trying to get a sense of what it means for their company as they're coming to terms with their use case is a little bit different than everybody else's, and trying to make sense of how it all fits in with their use case. So I think that was the gist of this topic.
Sure. So this is fortunately or unfortunately where boberdoo does the disclaimer. So we are not lawyers, and so when you ask us these, like a lot of these are our answers are not coy or meant to be coy, but are truthful. So like when we say to you, we think that you should ask your legal counsel what this means for your company. It is true because you are the one, if you are consuming these leads and calling them, you are the one that is at risk of these regulatory changes. So boberdoo is a software from a technological standpoint. It can be set up to handle one-to-one consent or not, and to give our clients the most flexibility depending on which route your business or what acceptable level of risk that your business has. And so when you're talking about selling leads to a third party, that same question should be directed at the third party. So we can't answer on their behalf. Those are questions that you should be having with your partners. Obviously, those that you're selling leads to, but then also leads, those that you're buying leads from. Just to recap, lots of questions around source calculations, source cost calculations, and bids being returned to vendors. This is where one of those cases where the APIs and forms, dynamic consent versus standards do behave differently. So with ping post consent, it is always calculated. And the lead cost is set as the price after margin. And then that is finalized after the sale is complete. So if you do have opened a ticket or requested post reject, for example, that can ultimately affect the final lead cost of a source cost of a lead. Because as that lead is then matched or on the post reject and sold at a different price, that margin calculation may be different. And then that is where that behavior is different from ping post lead. So when you're looking at evaluating whether or not a lead or a vendor, for example, needs to convert to ping post consent, how you are bidding on those leads, and if you want to be consistent across partners, or if you do want to have those exceptions, that flexibility exists, both based on which API you are using. As a personal note from me, I'm of the belief that consistency is something to strive for here. So if you do set up and convert everybody to ping post for consent, and then you set up all of your partners that require consent, and then all of your partners that do not require consent to be in that same bucket, Essentially, those that do not require consent are just eligible for more of those incoming pings. So it's more inclusive. And then as a reminder, fixed cost is not considered for a source on a ping post consent API or dynamic consent form. So for these reasons, we do recommend setting up new sources. The next was questions around seeing dynamic consent. So we'll jump into a lead system here. There are some things to check out. So if you bear with me, at a high level, take a look at forms or a new form reject report, different places in the leads tab, and then also as a call to action to you all, where else are you looking for that dynamic consent visibility? So as I mentioned, our new form rejects report that does separate these rejects from your typical lead reject report, which is nice because you can evaluate these separately. Some of our clients may be getting thousands and tens of thousands of rejects in that report on a daily basis. It's not realistic to have to comb through that. This separates that out so that you can easily digest, diagnose potential form issues, and act on them quickly to save traffic. We also have been adding descriptions into the reports as well to help identify headers. The next place to see dynamic consent, and a lot of that is in the lead system. So first and foremost, just at a glance, the green lead log indicates that it is a dynamic consent API or form. If you click on it, you will see normal logs here. We do have versions of the lead logs that it will be coming out here in the coming weeks. When we're looking to, on a page that has more leads and we're trying to filter down and drill down into those that do have dynamic consent versus those that do not, the filter tab is one place where we have built that functionality. You now can drill down based on that API or based on specific form types, which again gives you that help, in addition to pings and posts and unmatched leads and outside services. So that gives you that visibility, see who is posting or pinging into the system with those dynamic consent specs, for example. The other tool that is in the filter settings that will be helpful will be the opposite. So you have a partner and you're looking to see those leads, those pings that filter set would be eligible for. This new switch helps to then filter down on this page to only those similar leads. So it does put that additional condition on that filter as well. So next up, questions around the forms and redirects. So we'll take a look at a live example with networks here. This example will be pinging into the system, then posting, then redirect. This would be a case where you would be selling to both retail and networks or broker buyers with redirects, for example. So you do have the flexibility of doing both. So this would be a case, though, where you did not have a retail buyer and networks was the either the highest or the only buyer of that ping when it came into the system. However, you could also keep a standard lead form where you're essentially collecting the entire lead information on one step or the first flow, posting the full lead into the system, pinging that lead out to the various networks, for example, if you only sell to brokers, and then capturing the highest bid along with that redirect URL and redirecting the consumer. So the redirect options do work with both the standard and the dynamic consent forms. Go here. Okay, so again, rather than using test, I'm going to use some different information. And then we at Boberdoo are going to contact networks and let them know about this lead here that was submitted, so that they can proactively anything more to be selected here. So again, we're going to cross our fingers. So we have proceeded to the next step, which is thank you for submitting. We will be in touch shortly. This is the network's lead confirmation, redirect URL. So we do see the system. Now, what this option is, we don't know. So this is what the consumer sees. They can click next and then be taken back to the home page. But if we bring this back into Boberdoo, we see the ping bid being returned. And then rather than those post rejects, we do see the success and then that redirect URL. That is what the Boberdoo system grabbed and used to redirect the consumer to that we will be in touch shortly thank you page. So in previous tests, that also displayed contractors. And so when we answer questions like, does it work every time? There are cases where it doesn't. We don't know the answer as to why. This is something that we're going to learn with you, and as you share this information. So I apologize, but some of these are struggles that you see with testing, especially new testing with new testing protocols. One thing to note is that the cost is set to 0 on these post rejects. This system is not set up currently with any margin for our testing purposes, so the cost and the price of the partners filter sets are the same. So we wanted to cover again the display priority, also look into the custom delivery to draw this association between the company's display options, and then also more specifically around those brokers, those companies that are returning either a different end seller or multiple sellers back to be displayed to the consumer. So we'll take a look at a custom delivery example. Just as a reminder, on the partner company display priority, first and foremost, anything that is returned in the custom delivery is used. Next up, the consent settings seller company name is used, and then the partner company information is used only if those other settings are not configured. And then we do have the seller company phone and HTML offer that can be used to enhance the retail, typically the retail partner display to the consumer. And we, of course, advise reviewing these account settings, especially the partner account settings, uh, when you're going through these with your team. So if we go into the lead system here, we'll take a look at the specs and at a custom delivery. So ping post API specs. And if we look at the custom delivery, which is the first in priority that is used, this would be also what is used in a broker delivery. So anything that is returned, whether they return one company, multiple companies in their response. If we look, for example, this delivery here, we have an example PHP response set up to capture the response from this API that would include the seller company name. So when we say capturing the company name in the response, it would typically be done in the PHP like this here. The fields obviously may vary depending on the individual API specs. So if this partner with this custom delivery is matched, then that company or seller company name would be returned in the API to a vendor or to your website if you have a custom form, and then be presented in the response with an individual bid ID. So this is where the seller company name would be returned, again, along with that individual bid ID and individual bid. So while we're dabbling in the custom delivery wizard, lots of questions, especially people that have built their own deliveries. This is different. It's a different process. The custom delivery wizard is not built to handle the full exchange of receiving the dynamic matches. Quite honestly, the best way to do tests on one-to-one consent is to build a dynamic consent form in your lead system. We can go through like the quickest way to do that here in a second, but that gives you the visual experience of what happened. Plus, you have a form there. It's very easy then to set up either new partners, add them, and you always have that there as a reference. It's an easy way to get leads at. So for new clients that sign up on Boberdoo today, we're proactively building a dynamic consent form for every client. So when it comes to test lead, you are going to receive a response that looks something like this. If you include that in the URL parameters, test lead equals 1. The response is always matched. Doesn't matter what happens. And then the total bids is always 0. Doesn't matter what happens. That is just how the API is currently behaving with regards to test lead equals 1. It's just the current behavior. As mentioned, the testing process is different. This test lead equals 1 was built originally simply to test that matched unmatched on a ping and a post. Again, the best way would be to just use a dynamic consent form, because then you have that visual cue as well. All right. Michael, I think looking at there, we got through the general ones that we wanted to cover. Maybe you could take a look at some of those more specific ones, and we could cover some of those. And then also take a look at some of the live ones that might have come in during the call here.
So I guess one of the questions we can look at, are there any are there any major changes in the technical level we should do or take with the new update? I guess it's
Yeah. So that short answer is yes. If you have to address one-to-one consent, then yes, you do have to make changes. Um, I think what those changes are depend a lot on your partners and how you are handling those leads. So that's where I would start. Um, when you look at your partners, if you are selling only to networks and Angie's and Modernize, that is a much different use case than if you are selling entirely to retail contractors, as the complete flip side. And so looking at your demand, your partners, and determining what their requirements are would be step one, because that gives you what your demand is essentially, and you can aggregate that. I'm finding partner labels to be a very good way to do that, so that it gives you that visual cue at the aggregate of who is what. And then when you're going to your partners, that helps to determine what is one of those other questions that we have seen a lot of, which is, I have an existing relationship with BB4. They are a lead generation company. Do we need to have new sources, or what new sources need to be set up? Without knowing what your demand side is, it's probably really difficult to even answer that question. But knowing, hey, the vast majority of my partners require one-to-one consent, or the vast majority do not. I only have 3 buyers that do, or that's going to drive a lot of that vendor discussion. The one thing that I would say for looking at the vendor side is we've covered some of the reasons why, from a technical standpoint and from just an organizational standpoint, that you would want to have separate sources. But when you are looking at it in actual filter sets, I think that having a source, being able to classify them of whether or not they do provide one-to-one consent leads is important, because if everything is coming through the same source, both one-to-one and non-one-to-one on the same on the same feed or same source, for example, coming into your system, it will be very difficult to really drill down and be able to determine any sort of demand.
the form builder has a lot of great tools in it, and a lot of our clients are getting more and more familiar with that. And so, if you could speak about the increase of the functionality of the form builder.
Yeah, so I would say, I know, yeah, you had mentioned there were questions around like templates, for example. Um, we do have basic options. As far as things like CSS, there are options for you to build your own CSS templates, or outsource to developers and then include an external CSS. Um, Boberdoo does build front-end landing pages or just the forms themselves, and we have a team that uh, does CSS templates to match the look and feel of your landing page to your website. So, in an effort to help transition you to dynamic consent, if you have a website, we will do your first one for free. Try to get that matched and get you, a draft at no cost. And then, of course, if you want additional ones or tweaks, things like that, we can always work on a custom project. But um, we have been doing a lot with clients just to match their current forms and to ease that transition to the dynamic consent flow. But the nice thing is then once you have those set up, they're very easily applied to other landing pages because you can either just take this embed code and put that onto multiple landing pages, effectively creating your own template moving forward, or very simply copy forms once they're built. So the scale, once one is built out to your liking, there's a lot of options and ways to do that. Other functionality that people are utilizing or starting to dig in more. Obviously, the dependent thank you pages. So as you're running your own traffic, the other options when there are no matches are becoming more important. So the resubmit lead as standard and continue with form options here, which effectively do the same thing. So essentially what this does is when that ping comes into your system and you do not have any matches, essentially there are no companies to present to the consumer for one-to-one consent. Similarly, on the ping stage. So these options will convert the API action to ping post lead and then continue to process that lead under the standard flow. And that will bring that lead into the system with rather than the ping post and those instructions and constraints, it will come in under the standard lead log. So if there are clients that maybe presumably get reprocessed leads or something like that, they would be eligible for those leads at a later point in time. It also gives you that ability to just capture that lead. So you may have other TCPA language on your form that they are opting into, your newsletter, some follow-up service, something like that. Again, I'm just speculating, but that would allow you to continue and collect that lead into the system along with the rest of it, rather than rejecting it and having it never meet it at all.
Another question that's related to forms. I'll just read it exactly as it was presented. Can we incorporate the functionality of form builders like FormStack, etc., and have templates that we can use in it? And I think you touched on the templates, but in terms of the FormStack features.
So I would say we are interested in building and enhancing the functionality of the form, especially with usage. So the more clients that we get to use the system, and we'd love to get your feedback. If you have open tickets, obviously we'll take it any way we can get it now, but we are working on a way to more formalize that feedback for the form builder as well.
And then the only other forms related question, can you suggest any of our tutorials that would be good for people to start with?
Time permitting, we're going to go through a form right now. The flow is pretty linear. And so while there are options there, again, utilizing a copy function, things like that, once you get a base set up, again, scale becomes very easy. So we have, again, standard versus dynamic forms. We're going to cover dynamic default sources, but as you saw with that test lead, you can pre-pop information. So this is if there is no other information present. Similarly with landing page. The CSS, again, you can build your own. We use Frankenstein. So then we have our submit buttons. If you follow Troutman, I know the Troutman 15, you want the text to match your consent language, for example. This gives you that ability to align those. Post reject. So again, with post rejects, this is a switch that you need to have enabled to work both for APIs and for forms. If enabled, you will see this text here. That is where you can guide the consumer. Sorry, the company rejected your info. And so that helps guide the consumer towards the process, because the next best scenario is going to be served up. So the consumer can either select multiple matches or click the agree if it's exclusive. We have select all options and pre-select all options, then would be used in shared scenarios. Again, advise you check with your legal team on the viability of these options. And then with CSS, you want to make sure that those are clearly displayed to the consumer. With TCPA for no matches. So what happens when that ping comes in and there are no matches? Is there any TCPA text to display? Are you continuing on to the next form, or is this going to get redirected just to a click offer, for example, and it doesn't matter? But you can use magic strings here to then populate in the TCPA text. So that can then be used throughout. Similarly, for exclusive match info here, the big difference that we want to point out is the partner company name. You will want to make sure is included in the TCPA text for exclusive matches, because that is what dynamically inserts it into your general TCPA text for exclusive matches. So without that, there is no company name to explicitly state that one-to-one consent. So that's a very important one. And then again, whatever your language would be for non-exclusive or shared scenarios, because those do not contain the company names, would be more of typically this, less your magic strings, and more phrased around a shared scenario. So next up, we have dependent thank you pages. What happens after that lead then is submitted? You can display company information on the matches, including the HTML offer and seller phone fields from the consent settings. If you're selling retail, you can just display text, or you can redirect them if you have custom thank you pages, or if you redirect them to a crossover, something like that, and you can then use those magic strings. Similarly, we touched on with the no matches. The other options being to resubmit the lead as a standard, which then again post that lead in with ping post lead API as opposed to the ping post consent API. Or again, redirecting them to a click offer because of the no matches. So you can do that on the thank you page or right off the ping. So no matches on the ping, just redirect them right away. Oops. And we have some validation in here so that you can put in blank URLs. So next up, we have third-party scripts. Trusted form is a simple button to enable. You do have to enter your account code and key for Journaya, and then the tag manager, something you could just enter your ID into here if you want it to be following the form as opposed to your individual pages. Next up, we have the field configuration. So you'll see my view is slightly more advanced. I have some hidden fields here that you do not have access to because typically you are not pushing your hidden fields to the form. Those are collecting tracking values internally. So you're really only dealing with the client or the consumer facing fields. If you do have fields in here that should be hidden or internal fields, for example, TCPA text or TCPA, lead ID token, things like that, we can reclassify those fields for you very easily. But you have options here for editing the field. You can edit the input type. You can edit the question. And there are validation options as well, depending on the field type. You can also set them as hidden if they're not required, if you don't want those on the page, or if you want to default values. If, for example, I wanted Chicago to post into every single city, we can do that. This gives you flexibility. For example, if you're on the project, if you're in home improvement and you are bringing all of your leads into one lead type, but you're driving traffic to a roofing specific landing page, you know that is going to be the project. You can then default and hide these as needed. Then finally, we have the layout of the form itself. This is the the first page. This can be essentially, you can build out multiple pages here, but you want to make sure that all of your filtered and fields are before the ping submit. So this page allows you to align that. You can do multiple pages, pre-submit and then after. But once you get that aligned, this is all drag and drop. And then different options for that layout here. You're simply placing this script on any URL, and then coming back here, you can control the look and feel of this form. You can edit this form from Boberdoo, and it will get pushed to any place that has that code. So if you were then going to, let's say, drive traffic from a Google campaign, Google Ads, you could create a link. You could select Google or whatever your appropriate source was. You can also then add in UTMs or any other tracking fields. So this could be used not only for Google, but for affiliate tracking as well. And then this is that click URL that would be used in the destination URL of a campaign, or the click URL that you give to an affiliate that can then be used for tracking.
We'll switch gears here. We have actually 3 questions in a series from Dan that we'll touch on. And so first, are you also already integrated with and receiving this same redirect URL info from Modernize and eLocal? If not, what are our options with these buyers?
So with Modernize, we have set up. So with Modernize, Angie and not don't know about eLocal at all, but we have set up the deliveries, but we do not currently have publisher accounts for Boberdoo for independent testing. So we're working on getting those. But if you have direct relationships and specs and a Boberdoo form, you don't have to wait for our publisher accounts. These are all live in your system. So this can be treated just like any other custom delivery. We can build the custom delivery to be a new one in your system so that when a partner matches and you're using a dynamic consent or a standard Boberdoo form, it will capture that redirect. And then again, the redirect URL from the matching partner. We're working on more systematic, but from a functionality standpoint, the redirects are handled the same way. eLocal, I had not heard of. So if anybody has specs to eLocal, we'd love to see them.
And then part two of Dan's question, in order to sell to networks and Angie, which you mentioned, with the redirect URL and the widget on an exclusive match, do we need to switch over to the forms builder? Currently, their forms evidently are all in the forms manager. And so I guess the general question there is, if you got forms manager forms, I think I know the answer to this question, the forms builder is probably going to be required that you reset things up, but I'll let you answer that.
The answer is yes. So in general, the Boberdoo Forms Manager will be retired. We do not have a date set on that yet. It's not anything that's imminent. But the Forms Builder is replacing the Forms Manager. So if you have questions or need help with transitioning forms, please let us know. We can certainly talk out and help with that process, help architect it, and support it as needed.
And then part three of Dan's questions, are leads already seeing the dynamic redirect URL and widget when matching with networks and Angie? Following it up to say that they're having difficulty telling if it's working. But he says, but I know we have previously attempted to create a working delivery with a dynamic redirect URL. And so I guess a few questions kind of embedded in that.
Sure. So this is where, several things have to be in place for that to happen. So number one, when you look at it from a inbound side of the equation, you either have to be using the ping post consent API or a Boberdoo form. And so that has to be requirement one. Number two is that the partner, keeping with networks in this case, has to have the redirect custom delivery set up, which is specific to a new delivery. It's just not automatic in their existing. So that is a different delivery. Dan, I know you have one, but just speaking more generally to everybody in the webinar, if you have an existing delivery, it's not going to just magically change to a redirect. There are new specs and a new delivery that has to be created. Then the third part, then when we look at a lead, is that you will actually see the redirect URL being returned in the success response. So when we look at the successful post to networks, we see the success code, their essentially their equivalent of their lead ID, and then that redirect URL along with the price confirmation on the post. So that would be the the uh, the visual place to look at that in the logs.
So we do have one more question, and it's what conditions need to be true to be able to keep the same source for a seller that has both dynamic consent and general consent leads?
The conditions that must be true are that you, as the boberdoo client, must be okay with go back to last week's demo. Into our other lead system. So you must be okay with the same source possibly having bids calculated in different ways uh, based on whether or not it is the ping post API or the ping post consent API. So for example, if you look at this one versus which is calculated at 80% of the sale price, this lead here is the exact same lead. This lead here is the same lead sold to this broker for $30. And then the cost is $25.50, which is 80%. This same source has a fixed cost of $10, came through the ping post lead API as opposed to ping post consent, has a different cost calculated. So those are the types of things that would be essentially in the system. So when you look at aggregating that reporting, you're essentially aggregating all of it up to one source into one general amount. So you have, less insight into any of that information. So those would be, I guess, the big ones that I see immediately. The second would be if you have buyers that require one-to-one consent, you then presumably have to exclude that source from their filter set. So they would be eligible for none of that traffic because you cannot distinguish that source, which of their incoming pings have which of those have incoming are from, well, actually, I take that back. I mean, we do have this switch in there. So, I mean, you could build it out. So it is possible. Sure. You could build it out. But I guess when you're looking at, systematizing your setup, you're just adding additional switches that you have to make sure your team remembers or documents to select, as opposed to being able to go through and label this partner requires one-to-one consent. I'm going to then select all filter or all sources that have one-to-one consent, or this one can take all labels, and being able to make that more operationally sound. So, I think that probably sums it up.
Well, that's the last question that we have through the chat and that we received prior to this.
Thank you very much. We will get this webinar posted, and we'll get it as a sidebar update. So any of your team members that wasn't able to attend, make sure we get this disseminated out to y'all. So thank you
And
very
this
much.
webinar is weekly. It's noon Central Time every week. Stay tuned for information about that.
Exactly. Thanks, Michael.
You bet. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.